This summer, I had the great privilege of traveling with some of you to Buchach, to Agnon's hometown, to the major sites of Western Ukraine, to the old Jewish world of Galicia. And the highlight of our visit was to Agnon's small hometown of Buchach, which you can see in some of this video installation behind you. In the Hebrew quote that is part of this video installation that was filmed a few years ago, in 1930, after having left Buchach as a 20-year-old in 1908, in 1930, Agnon made his only real substantive return visit back to the old world. He spent about a week in Buchach. From this, the literary imagination spun a week-long visit into a year-long story called A Guest for the Night, in Hebrew, Oreach Natalalun, the book that the Nobel Prize Committee put their finger on as the height of his literary achievement. It's this very bittersweet, nostalgic tale of a Hebrew author who lives in a house in the Talpiot neighborhood of Jerusalem, very much like this, married with a wife and 2 children, very much like the author, who returns to his hometown of Buchach, although in the novel he's created this fictional name called Shibush, which means both mixed up and confused, but also means agornished, a little nothing, a little bumpkinville, as it were. And he documents for the reader what this nostalgic homecoming is, that sense that you can't go home again, that you can't step into the same river twice, the shock that's accompanied by trying to return to your hometown and discover that all of the world that you remember or misremember because that's the way memory works, misremember because you willfully have altered your memories of how things were when you were a child, a depiction of how it's all changed. I had an almost mirror image of the experience when we went back, because despite my many years of involvement with Agnon's writing and Agnon's scholarship and research, I had never been to Buchach, although I felt that I could have walked its streets blindfolded and known where I was going. The sense not of going back to a place that I didn't recognize, a place that was intimate and familiar to me, that I went to and didn't recognize, which is the experience that presumably Agnon himself felt, and which the narrator of A Guest for the Night certainly feels. I felt I was going to a place that I had known intimately just through the pages of the book. And that's a little bit, I think, what we're here to talk about tonight. And I'm so pleased to welcome our visiting author, Sofia Andrukhovych, who was part of this very interesting project sponsored by our good friends at the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter, and through the Agnon Literary Center in Buchach, which we were very privileged to visit this summer. Before we hand the microphone to Mariana, who is the director of the Agnon Literary Center in Buchach, I would just add that when our group from Beit Agnon was visiting Buchach this summer, we rendezvoused with her. She spent the better part of the day with us, joining the guides, giving us a behind the scene. We had an opportunity to visit the center's headquarters in the library of Buchach, and I can't tell you how many of the participants in their evaluation of the trip pointed to our meeting with you as one of the highlights of the whole 9 days visiting the Ukraine, to meet with somebody who cares so deeply about these areas of common concern. So we thank you very much for that.
Thank you too. And also, first of all, I want to say thanks, first of all, to the Agnon House, because it's the first time when we have this cooperation between Ukraine and Israel, and also to the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter. And you can see that the book in my hand. It's a second edition of this book, The Key in the Pocket. It's it's like a final step of our literary residency in Buchach, and you can see these 3 language versions, original in Ukrainian and also English and Hebrew. And it's also very important to say that it's the first time when we have Hebrew language versions of any text actually in Ukraine. Probably not in Ukraine, but I'm speaking about Buchach and Jerusalem in this case. So Sofia Andrukhovych was a member of this literary residency that we hosted 2 years ago in Buchach, and Sofia spent 1 week like in Agnon and lived in a hotel like Agnon too. So I want to give you this microphone to introduce you, and probably you can say something about your visiting, and thank you for your membering in this project.
Thank you, Mariana. Good evening. I was born in Ivano-Frankivsk. It was called Stanislav earlier, and it is town which is situated not far from Buchach. But nevertheless, I've never been to Buchach until Mariana's invitation. And for me, it was really great adventure, because I wanted, first of all, I wanted to know better about Agnon himself. And the second thing for me was to know this little tiny town, because I was really wondering what could it look like, such provincial town, though Stanislaviv, Ivano-Frankivsk is a provincial town itself too, and it was during the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. It was like one of the most eastern points on the map, so when I came there, it was October. Like Jeffrey said, I had the similar feeling that this town was just very known for me from the Agnon's novel A Guest for the Night. Even the nature, even the feeling of the wind, this feeling of restlessness and lostness was very similar to the words with which Agnon described this town. And even in this, in those lines, we heard during we watched this small film, this fragment about man who was trying to repair the road. I'm afraid nothing has changed from those times, but one of the main feelings was I was really enchanted by this town. It's, you know, you've been there, I understood. So, you know, I had the feeling it is somehow round. It is because it's situated during those soft hills. Someone said, and I liked very much this sentence, those words, that if you look onto the town from one of the hills, you can imagine that someone really great holds the town in his hand, and it is very beautiful. And you can see all those old buildings that are left from the previous centuries, and they are unfortunately not in the very good state right now, and it's one of the sad sides of the of this story. But at the same time, you have the feeling of the wholenessness of this place. And for me, one of the revelations, though Stanislaviev has very similar history comparing to Buchach. There were in such Galician towns there lived people from different communities, you know this. There were a lot of Jewish people, Polish people, Ukrainian people, and German people, and they lived, in some way they lived together, but they lived separately too. And though I knew this history from my childhood, but when I came to Buchach, I've had an impression that I saw this very rich and deep and complicated history more clearly. It's like maybe sometimes you have to get larger distance to the things to see them more clearly. Sometimes you don't see things which are in front of you. It's like, it reminds me such a legend about an African tribe. Maybe it's not a legend, maybe it's a real story even, because it makes sense. They had aircrafts which were flying above them, but they didn't notice them because there were not such a thing in their culture. So sometimes I feel like such a woman who knows or who sees things but doesn't necessarily notice them. And so the most tragical and the most mournful thing for me was to realize, seeing all those old streets and all those old buildings in Buchach, to realize that the whole great world, which was so much alive earlier, and which is so in such fantastic way described by Agnon, the whole world has disappeared, and the people who live nowadays in those buildings, they often don't realize themselves who lived there earlier and what had happened there. And I think after my only 1 week in Buchach, I felt that I want to do something to this, because I believe Agnon himself, he wrote, for example, this book with his stories about Buchach.
Hero of our city and its fullness.
Yeah.
Can I just ask everyone to please silence your phones?
When he wrote those stories, he wanted to preserve the history of his people and of Jewish community and the history of this town he was born in, for the others. He wanted to save the memory, and I felt in a way that I have to do the same for maybe for Ukrainian people, to remind to myself and to others about those tragic and complicated things, to talk about the guilt, to talk about really complicated things. So for me, my journey to Buchach became something bigger, because I didn't expect myself that Buchach will be the next place where my new novel is situated, because the previous one was my book was situated in my native town, and it tells about the Austrian-Hungarian times, and I tell that in this book about the different communities, about their common and separate life. But this new novel, I think it's my previous book, my previous novel. Felix Austria, yeah.
Yes, it's Ukrainian. It's original version of this book.
But the novel I am working on right now is I think I have to thank for it to Agnon himself, and to his writings, and to the possibility to see Buchach, and to start to think about complicated history.
Can you keep the microphone off?
Okay.
We're going to have a little conversation, then we'll open it up to other questions. Can you just tell us a little more about what you're up until now? We understand that your week in Buchach has changed your course as an author, and will forever leave its imprint on your writings that will come after. But tell us a little more about the topics you've been writing on until now, the books and stories you've written until now.
My previous books were very different. They differ from each other. I wrote the book of the short stories about different such stories about different women. Then I wrote the novel, which described such a growing up experience of the young person. After that, I wrote a kind of historical novel, which is Felix Austria, I told you about, and this book was translated into a couple of different languages, and it
Has it been translated into English?
Yes, it is. A translator is working on. Yeah. It is translated into Polish, into German, into French, Hungarian, Czech.
Do you know what will it be called in English?
Felix Austria. Yeah. It has a different title only in German. Papierjunge. Somehow they decided that Felix Austria is bad name for the book in Germany, that Germans won't notice it or even get annoyed with such title. And it tells a story of the relationships of two women, one of whom is Ukrainian, and she lost her parents when she was a little child, so she doesn't remember her parents, and she is from such poor Ukrainian family, and the other one is half Polish woman and half German. Her father is German and her mother is Polish, and it's rich and noble family, and this family takes this little orphan girl to their house, and they raise this girl, and she becomes in a way servant and at the same time best friend or even sister to her mistress. And this story is situated in the on the beginning of 20th century, before the events before the First World War, when the things looked very peaceful and when people had an illusion that the world will stay like this forever. And my book is dedicated to the illusions itself, to the illusion itself. So I explore this theme, what things look like and how do we perceive, we lie to ourselves, and why do we do that, and how do we create the world we see, and how does it differs from the real world.
You described that the encounter with Agnon and reading A Guest for the Night and your time spent in Agnon's shadow in Buchach, has influenced you, and you mentioned you feel the need now as a writer to grapple with what you called the complex history and the complex past and the complexities of memory, which I assume you're referring to the events of the Holocaust.
Yes.
But in fact, as you know, A Guest for the Night both describes a world before the Holocaust and was also written before the Holocaust. It had the unusual timing of being published at the very beginning of September 1939. As Hitler is invading Poland, the book is on the newspaper on the same day that carries the headlines of the invasion of Poland, is an advertisement for this new book that Agnon has published. So I'm curious how, what before your encounter with Agnon and Buchach, to what degree you were thinking of these topics of the Jewish history, or was this something brand new to you that you were confronting as a writer for the first time, and how, aside from the Holocaust, which is obviously overshadows so much of has to overshadow all cultural production, in the 70 plus years since, how the encounter with Jewish memory and Jewish history itself prior to the destruction now will somehow work its way into your creative process.
Of course, it wasn't the first time of my encounter with this theme, with this subject, but those things, they have so many stages that you feel all the time, you feel that you knew nothing just a minute ago, and maybe only now at this second you start to understand a bit. And yes, it's in a way it's very it's very sad that people tend to concentrate on the hard topics, and they don't talk about the times when it was more peaceful and when people get along in better and more productive way with each other. I always knew, being raised in Stanislaviv, I always knew that about this, about the history, the Jewish history of small Galician towns, about how Jewish people were building the towns, because we know, for example, that Ukrainian people were often the people from villages and towns in Galicia, and not only in Galicia, were built and developed by the Jewish people. With the Jewish people were urban people. So now we are this problem for me is was connected to the to nowadays Ukrainian people who don't realize this history, and it's not just about the Jewish history. It's about not knowing our own Ukrainian history too, and we can explain this with the hard Soviet period, for example, when the history was erased from the people's memory, and it was forbidden to talk about such hard topics even inside people's families. All the documents were destroyed. Thank you. Were destroyed, and people were sometimes they were killed, even killed for telling different sides of the previous events. So we are in the process now in Ukraine when we all the time we are learning about ourselves. Jeffrey, you asked about what do people in Ukraine know about Agnon, and unfortunately they know very little about Agnon, but they know very little about Ukrainian, many Ukrainian authors too, and just the couple, maybe 10 years, 5 last years, Ukrainian people start to find the new names, find the stories of the authors, of the writers, of the people who did something, who were doing something for Ukrainian history and culture and tradition. So it's the same with the Jewish culture for Ukrainian people. But for me, the main thing, very important thing, is to connect all those topics, to show and to learn myself, how all those topics and the sides of the life are connected, how do they intertwine with each other.
So if I can turn our attention to Mariana for a second, this need that you describe to promote both Jewish and Ukrainian history and culture and literature and memory, it seems to me that the intersection of these two things is really part of the focus of what you're doing at the Agnon Literary Center in Buchach. So, most people that aren't devotees of the Agnon House would probably, to us it's obvious why you're doing it, but to some other people it probably seem a little curious what's going on there in Buchach. So maybe just tell us a little bit about how the center came about and what you're doing, what the focus is, and how it's advancing this cause that Sofia, I think, so powerfully described.
Thank you, Jeffrey, for this question. It's really a very interesting story because we started our project 3 years ago, We are working like NGO institution in Ukraine, and the main topic, the main sense of our project is to speak about Agnon heritage in Ukraine. Actually, not only in Buchach, but in the whole Ukraine. And all our projects is dedicated to Agnon heritage, but not only Agnon. It's like puzzles of different history and heritage in Buchach. It's history, first of all, of Jewish community, but it's also history of Polish and Ukrainian, and how to combine all these communities. It's really a good question now. It's not easy to speak about this history, and it's important to speak also. And we decided to make this project of literary residency to begin to speak about it and to begin to invite Ukrainian famous authors, for example, like Sofia Andrukhovych is to Buchach. It's really a small town, you know, and it's really important to people who are living in Buchach to know that it's not like a village. It's really a very important town in the map of Ukraine, because it's town of, first of all, of Agnon. Then I'm speaking about Emanuel Ringelblum or Simon Wiesenthal. They also were born in Buchach.
For a little town,
yes.
It has a remarkably impressive roster of who's who. Emanuel Ringelblum, the famous Warsaw Ghetto, the Oneg Shabbat, was Agnon's maternal cousin.
Yes, I know.
There must have been something in the water.
Yes.
No, Freud's father was from Buchach.
So it's really important to speak about this topic in Buchach. We made our first steps, and it's really very interesting to see how people speak about it. Because every month we have one or two presentations, not about only Agnon. It's like a literary meeting with Ukrainian authors, books presentations, literary tours also. We have tours around a book, a guest for the night. It's really very popular in Ukraine, you know. Many people are interested.
It's translated
yes,
to Ukrainian.
It's in Ukrainian actually. I don't have this book here in Israel, but it's you can come to all bookstore and can buy this book. It's not very expensive, and it's easy to buy. So this project, I'm speaking now about this literary residency, was the first step when we put on the map of Ukraine Buchach like a city of literature, the city of Nobel Prize winner, laureate, yes, Agnon. And in this book you can see a bust. It's a photo of this bust. We, like Agnon Literary Center and also Buchach Council, put this bust on Agnon Street like a symbol of Agnon, actually, and a symbol of anniversary of his Nobel Prize winning. Yes, and actually in that year we had this literary residency, and Sofia was also on October. So it's short.
We spoke about the encounter between Ukrainians and Jews, and between living young writers and dearly departed famous writers. But for both of you, this is your first visit to Israel and to Jerusalem, and also, of course, your first visit here to the Agnon house. So I'm just curious how what your impressions of this first visit has been, and Mariana, for you, if you're already beginning to sense that the encounters you've had here will also make their way into your imagination and creativity in writing. So,
maybe I can say something. For me, it's really it's impressive to be here, because it was my dream to be in the Agnon house. Actually, yes, from my childhood, because I know about Agnon. It was not a problem to read about that Agnon was born in Buchach, and in school, in my school, in gymnasium in Buchach, we had some lessons about Agnon. We can read some abstracts and some short stories about Agnon. So for me it was like, oh my God, I want to see one day this building, this Agnon house, how it looks. So for me it's really very important to be here now, and also in Israel, because it's really a very good opportunity to start to think about both these countries, like an encounter, like a cooperation, like a first step to be together, something like this. So thank you. Good.
You can feel clearly that Jerusalem is one of the centers of the world when you are here. So I felt it clearly, and I have really powerful feelings about an atmosphere of this city. And I thought that though Buchach is such tiny town somewhere on the end of the world, and Jerusalem is one of the centers of the world, but and they belong to the different worlds too, but you can see some similar features too. For example, this life of and intersection of very different cultures. Though the history is different, everything is different, but at the same place, people with different languages, different religions, different heart problems, trying to live. So it's really powerful feeling.
In A Guest for the Night, there's a scene where the guest, who again has come back after many years of being away, comes back to Buchach, Shibush, and he's talking to this old childhood friend of his whose name is Schutzling, and he's describing his love for Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, and his Zionism, and etc. And this childhood friend says to him, the reason that you love Jerusalem is because you love Shibush. And it was only from Shibush that you developed the ability to have love of a place and to feel connected to a place. And there's something about that hometown, and certainly for the Jew in the exile who always longed for Jerusalem, and throughout much of history, the Jew in the exile was only able to long for Jerusalem because he wasn't able neither to visit nor to settle here. But that idea of that our connection to place comes from the hometown, from the birthplace, and that can then be exported to the larger question of a connection to Jerusalem, to Israel, I think touches on something here. We have time for a few questions from the audience. Please just stand up and speak loudly.
Should I stand up?
Or speak loudly.
I'll just speak loudly. Yeah, well, I really like this, I don't know, like this honest reflection that both of you sort of related to. First of all, Sofia said a very powerful sentence of Ukrainian are starting to learn about themselves. Like there's an identity process going on in Ukraine, especially on the young generation. It was very exciting. Maybe one opportunity I would like to hear more about. How was it like? I knew you before that because I heard about your activities in the center. I didn't know you actually grew up in Buchach, that you're actually from there originally. So it's very, that's very exciting to know that actually, in high school you were studying about, like you said, you already knew the name. And when I was in Buchach and I came there, there was no delegation whatsoever, but it was 2 years ago. And when I just got there, it was like a 4-hour bus with the common people from Lviv. I took it from Lviv. And I thought I knew Ukraine, but I was like, it was a very unique experience. I remember getting there and going to the fair, or the museum, whatever. And like, already on the way on the bus, because I speak some Russian, and people are always so nice to foreigners in Ukraine. It was like, speaking Russian to a complete foreigner, because I'm not really fluent in Ukrainian, or I don't really know the language, but you know, with my very basic Russian, everybody asked me, oh, that's so nice, and I had an Agnon book with me in Hebrew, which I pretty much recommend as your second, after Guest for the Night. It's called the City,
Yeah, the city in its fullness.
That should be the second one. That's actually more specific
Yes.
about Buchach and its history. That's very fascinating. He relates a lot to Ukrainians and Poles and Hungarians and Turks even, Muslims, Christians. And I remember my impression of Buchach was very pleasant, at least for coming from the outside. You know, you could see that it's a hard, can I say, like economically, you know, it's not one of the flourishing areas of Ukraine. That's pretty obvious, and the whole country is going through a very harsh reforms politically and everything that's going on. But that was amazing to see how much, like, everyone in town sort of takes pride in its name. You know, the name, like I saw it, but actually you can see it very clearly when once you get there after 4 hours in the bus. There are two centers. There's the church, okay, Catholic church, like in every, I don't know, other town of this sort. And then there's the museum, the center, the literary center, and you cannot miss it. It's like named after Agnon. You have this statue thing that's on the cover. That's the only place in the world. You know, we don't have it in Israel. There's no statue whatsoever of Agnon anywhere. There's no.
I know that
I mean, there are
in
street names, but
in
that's
Germany also they have probably.
Yeah, I know what you mean, but it's not a statue. I know. It's sort of
It's like,
written.
It's like a plaque, maybe.
Yeah, it's a plaque.
Exactly.
So that's the only place in the world. I was so pleasantly surprised that people are taking, and like you're saying, you know, and I want to ask you because, you know, we're talking a lot about Buchach, but Buchach is just as an example of what's going on in Ukraine right now. You know, there's the whole cultural, expanding integration with Europe, and Agnon is also a nice example because, you know, it's also related, like you said, to Germany. He spoke fluent Germany and Austro-Hungarian. And the same thing going on in Buchach is going on in, you know, bigger cities like Lviv and Odessa, discovering the Jewish past, but memorizing it and so on. And I would like to hear more about that, like, you know, in a more large scale of what's going on in Ukraine right now and how are you participating in it.
It's actually a good question because now in Ukraine really we have a new breeze, something like this, of a different project about memory, about Jewish history and heritage, especially in Lviv and also in Odessa and Kyiv and other cities. But Buchach is probably the first one little town can see such project about heritage, about Jewish community, about literature. For me, it's very important to be on this map. Actually, I told about that Buchach nowadays is on this literary map of Ukraine, but it's really very important because we know something about Chernivtsi, we know something about Buchach, about Lviv, about Brody, about Drohobych, all these cities and towns are famous for their heritage. But Buchach is really very tiny and small town, and in this very little piece of ground, I don't know how to say it, you can see how many people, famous people, were born. And for me, it's really important to say about it nowadays in Ukraine because it's our common heritage. It's not nowadays. It's like a part of Ukraine. It's nowadays is Ukraine, but Jewish history is our common heritage because we were neighbors. Yes, before the Second World War, we were neighbors. It's really complicated to speak about this. It's hard to speak in some cases, but it's important to start to speak about it.
Did you want to answer?
Maybe yes, maybe so. Okay.
Okay.
One of the things that Rabbi Sachs does constantly in his class is speak about Agnon did not write with knowledge of the Holocaust. Although it's impossible for us to read it without knowledge of the Holocaust. But he always uses World War I as the seminal event that caused the catastrophe that ended the Jewish community in the Ukraine, or started the end of the Jewish community in Ukraine. But what we don't hear is what happened to the Ukrainians, and also the simultaneous communist revolution that took place we never talk about that basically. We don't know what communism did to the Ukrainian culture during the 20th century.
For the Ukrainians themselves, all this 20th century was the most complicated thing because all the time from the First World War, the power would change all the time. The border were changing all the time. The new power came with a new language, with the new rules. Today you could wake up in the town with one power and with one language. The next day you had something different, and the people were lost. They didn't knew they were trying to stay alive, and they didn't have an opportunity to reflect on their identity, I'm afraid, and especially during this Soviet period, the Ukrainian people lost this feeling of who they are. So, as I said, everything was erased, and the Soviet politics was concentrated on the trying to make all Soviet people the same, to forget about their history. And so Soviet power was just killing the people who realized they were Ukrainian. They were forbidden to write in Ukrainian at some points, at some periods. But during the whole Soviet period, Ukrainian language, for example, was really unpopular, so to say, at the schools, especially at the central part or at the eastern part of Ukraine. Children could not learn Ukrainian. The parents could just say that my child doesn't want to learn Ukrainian. It wasn't necessary. And so
in my school in Kharkiv.
Where?
in Kharkiv,
Yeah.
yes. We were more lucky with Mariana and some of our parents, because my father, he's from Galicia, he's from Ivano-Frankivsk, but my mother is from Chernihiv, it's northern part of Ukraine. So, for example, I have the two different kinds of the history in on my parents' example, but I feel lucky that I was raised at the house where something like Ukrainian literature and Ukrainian language was a very natural thing. It was natural for me, so I know who I am exactly, but I can see the problems that people from the central part of Ukraine or the east confront now, because especially the problems connected to this current situation with the war with Russia, people who identified themselves because this Soviet period and the schools and the studying, they identified themselves with the Russian culture, and now the people start to ask themselves who they are, why is the situation like it is, and I can tell about very pronounced example because the friend of mine, he is Ukrainian writer, and he's already an adult man. He's in his 50s, and he was born and he lived in Donetsk.
Which is now occupied.
Yes, which is now occupied. And when those events started, Volodymyr Rafeenko felt he doesn't want to stay at this place. It was dangerous, of course, and it was not his ideological point to stay in this place, in this occupied place. So he left Donetsk and he went to Kyiv, where he didn't know anyone, he didn't have anything. But he came there with his family, and he was Ukrainian, a Ukrainian author, but he wrote his books in Russian all his life. He was raised in Russian culture and he spoke Russian, and he is really famous writer. He got the literature prizes in Russia all the time during this point. And suddenly he is in Kyiv, he has nothing, and the main thing, he realizes that he has to start everything from the beginning, even to understand who is he. So Volodymyr decided for himself that he will learn Ukrainian and he will start to write in Ukrainian because he is Ukrainian author. And I think in a couple of months his first book in Ukrainian will be published. So such changes are something very common now in Ukraine.
We have time for just a couple more questions. But ma'am in the back, you had started to ask a question earlier. And
Me?
yes, if it's still relevant.
Yeah, in fact it was for you, the
Oh,
moderator, but I can refer it to everyone. My question was, what is your idea why Shai Agnon is the only Israeli author that had the honor to get the Buchach Prize? And another thing is, I heard once that he said that an excellent author is the one that can follow two conditions. One is to know how to tell a story, and the second one, that his language is impeccable. And unfortunately, he said that most of the authors has only one of those conditions. So if you can refer to his work, what makes it so special?
In terms of that, I'm unfamiliar with that quote, but it sounds very authentic. That idea of the art of the storytelling, I think is well, the art of the storytelling is obvious, but the second, in terms of the mastery of language, was something so incredibly important to him. Your description of your friend who's made this transition from being a Russian author to a Ukrainian author is remarkable, because for most authors, writing fiction outside of their native tongue or their first language is almost unimaginable. So for Agnon as well, even though he knew Hebrew from a young age, Yiddish was his first language, and the fact that when he arrived in this country in 1908, at the age of 20, he committed himself only to writing in Hebrew, and that indeed part of his accomplishment was helping to craft this newly awoken, renewed, revived language as it was flowing out of his pen. Was part of his achievement, and the fact that he to date is the only Israeli to be recognized by the Nobel, even though we have many great authors in the past 50 years who are always on the short list. Even some authors whose political views wouldn't make them objectionable to a certain crowd in Stockholm.
Personally, I believe it's more than luck. I believe there was something in his footprint that was very, very specific.
Right. Well, all of the younger authors, Oz writes about this, Bet Yoshua, others, all of the authors that come after Agnon describe feeling this, being in his shadow and having to find their own voice. And, for the authors that were just one generation younger than Agnon and now we're a few generations, it was even harder. But he wins the Nobel in 1966, and it was very much interpreted correctly at the time as both being a prize for him and for his work. Part of it was the efforts, the lobbying already from the 1930s, mostly on the part of Mr. Shokin, his patron, to make sure that his works were translated. There are works of Agnon that have been translated into Swedish that hadn't been translated into English. Why Swedish? There's so many readers of Hebrew literature in Sweden. No, for obvious reasons. So there was a very organized campaign to bring him to the attention of those that needed to be aware of Agnon. But it was very much regarded as a prize for the Jewish people and for the young state of Israel. 1966 is just 20 years plus after the Holocaust. It's one thing that the Jewish people physically survived Auschwitz. It's another thing that they've resumed being creative, culturally creative, and now doing so in their own land, in their own newly reawoken language, and it was very much recognized as a prize for all of these things. The fact that it was 6 months before the Six-Day War and the international complications that came with that may have made it a little easier for a group of judges in Stockholm to give the prize to an Israeli, but who knows? The proceedings of the Nobel Committee are kept sealed for 50 years. They just last year opened the files on the year that Agnon won, although it didn't provide much great insight. We had learned that he had been a runner-up the year before in 1965, so it was something that they'd been considering, but beyond that, I really can't say. Yes, sir, you had a question.
Can I address this one primarily to Sofia? As a reader of Agnon and as a person from the Ukraine, when you read his story, sorry, from my apology, from Ukraine, cross out of that, seems a mistake from my boy. As a reader from Ukraine, when you read the story yourself, A Guest of the Night, do you pick up anything that is specifically Ukrainian in the spirit in which he wrote the book?
No, I don't. And I like this, those three words which describe this, the situation together and separately. The people from the different communities in those times, they lived together, but they lived separately. And so Buchach was more than in a half, I suppose. I believe it was more than in a half Jewish.
When Agnon lived there, it was about 60% Jewish.
Yes, more than half.
And there were times when there were 80% Jewish people. So it's understandable why this book and the others texts by Agnon were described only Jewish life.
You know, I didn't mean the content. I mean, the content we know is Jewish. But when you read it and you pick up the nuances in the book, is there anything in that there that you would see as a reflection of the fact that he'd spent part of his life in Ukraine?
Well, there are some things connected to the history of this place, to Polish history, to Potocki's and I don't remember now anything connected to Ukrainian. Maybe Mariana will, yeah.
As I remember, because I am first of all reading this novel in Ukrainian translation, but actually we have some problem in this Ukrainian translation, because it's not from Hebrew to Ukrainian, it's from Hebrew to English and to Ukrainian. It's translation of translation. Yes, it's not very good example, but it's really a good opportunity to know about what Agnon wrote. Yes, and actually maybe it's a reason because I was born in Buchach and I know this town like my native town, and I'm feeling sometimes like Agnon because I know all these narrow streets, all these squares.
This is what I was writing about.
Yes, and I wrote about that Buchach that nowadays you can also see. Some part of Ukrainian, not history, but maybe some part of Ukrainian
Atmosphere.
Yes, atmosphere. You can read.
You can see it in the
Yeah.
videos. no?
Yes. Actually, I want to notice that here you can see all these streets, not only Buchach, but maybe yes. Here you can see Buchach, and it's really very similar to this novel. Yes, we don't have actually the great synagogue. We don't have Beit HaMidrash. Nowadays it's like a marketplace. But we have a cemetery. We have all these streets. We have actually the house where Agnon was born. And the atmosphere, believe me, is the same. I think.
This is the quote. It's in 1930 when Agnon goes for this only a real visit back to the old world. He writes a letter back to a friend here in Jerusalem, and he writes,
I'm walking around the cities of Poland between World War I and World War II. The area is controlled by Poland. In the Batei HaChaim, the cemeteries, the euphemism for the cemeteries, and the marketplaces and the fairs. Sometimes it seems to me that the Jews, and even the non-Jews as it were, have read my stories and have arranged their lives based upon what I write in the story. Here's a story I write describing the beginning of the 19th century. And it looks to me, he says in 1930, that they walked right off the pages. But here, almost 90 years later, not much has changed. You can walk through that marketplace in Buchach, and it looks like it could be characters from The Bridal Canopy, or The Crooked Shall Be Made Straight, or City in Its Fullness, or A Simple Story, and all these wonderful stories of Buchach.
Yeah, also on Iron Noir, City and its whole, like this collection of stories about Buchach, I remember I read it in Hebrew, and he says there are some very funny and interesting anecdotes that he tells about the countrymen, Ukrainian countrymen, like he tells about, for example, young lovers like Ivan and Marushki, I think. He describes like sort of Ukrainian culture immersed into it, so it's maybe it should be your next project.
Yes, and there is a small story about such Ukrainian criminal, don't know, not exact word, but such folklore character, Dobush, and Agnon
Dobush,
yes,
with this hat.
Yes, such Ukrainian Galician Robin Hood, and who had some relationship maybe from Kolomea, one of the plots connected to Ukraine in Agnon's writings. But I wanted to say maybe what you said about Buchach, what we said about Buchach, which you can feel in Agnon's writings, and you see that nothing has changed. Maybe that was the feeling that made me to think about all those subjects more clearly, because in Ivano-Frankivsk, in Stanislaviv, you cannot feel this, you cannot have the similar feeling of this Jewish history. It's more already, it changed already. And in Buchach, everything is like canned, if you can say this.
Right beneath the surface.
Yeah.
I think that's a good way to end our conversation. I just mentioned that starting next a week from Sunday, we have a series here in English studying another great story of Buchach, Vayakov Lamishor, and the crooked shall be made straight. Very recently translated into English. 4-part series for those of you that can join us. And those of you that are new to Beit Agnon, please make sure to leave us your email so you can keep up with our activities, or like us on Facebook, as the kids say these days. But most especially, thank you very much to Natalia, to Mariana, and especially to you, Sofia, for your work. I'm looking forward to being able to read you in translation very soon.
And also have a small gift, a small present to the Agnon house. It's a gold pilava, a symbol of Buchach, a family symbol of Potocki.
Oh.
So it's...
Thank you.